as people are still coming up on the width, I think I want to say um, a very warm welcome to you here this evening. It's great that you're here. This is not a usual venue where we have such events, but we have a special reason for having this event here on the top floor of the B2B library, and that is that we celebrate the inauguration of a very special collection of books we received from the family of Helen Hartnell. And just a heads up before we start, we're video recording this event, so probably most of you won't be seeing video, but just in case you have any problem with that, just contact either me or Vladimir Ondarenko, who's our technical specialist now behind the camera. Thank you very much, Vladimir, for making this possible, especially for setting up the connection to Stanford, where Kim Scheppele is joining us remotely, sitting in a wheelchair, as I must say. So it's absolutely fantastic that you're with us, at least virtually today. And I hope you can hear us and you can see a bit of us. I know that you would have loved to be here today, but at least via the internet. So technology makes it possible. You're with us tonight and giving a picture, which is brilliant. Thank you very much. So I'm delighted that we're able to celebrate with you today the inauguration of the book collection of Professor Helen Hartnell in the VCB Library. And as I said, it's a special day, not only because we're celebrating this collection, but also because it would have been the 71st birthday of Helen today, if I'm right. I'm particularly pleased that Helen's brother, George, has come a long way from the United States, somewhere near Boston, from Maine. Okay, Maine. Well, unfortunately, in the United States, just for this event, we are absolutely pleased and honored. And actually, it was you who decided to donate these more than 1,000 academic books of Helen's to the library, and we're very grateful for that. And thank you for being with us tonight. It's a pleasure. So Helen passed away on Monday, 18th of September 2023, at the age of 38. For her, as well as for us, the Berlin colleagues who worked with Helen, the sudden and unexpected news of her cancer diagnosis was more than a shock. And the very few weeks leading up to her death were far too short. Helen Hartnell crossed the border between the different academic cultures and disciplines like hardly anyone else in German American socio-legal contexts. US lawyer, she came to Germany back in the early 1980s and worked in various legal contexts, including as a research assistant at the Free University of Berlin, was, I think, one of the first jobs she took on when she came here after she came here, and as a lawyer for an international law firm. From 1997 to 2013, she was a professor of law at the Golden Gate University in San Francisco, but she kept her connection to Berlin all the time. So I think she also had an apartment here, even when she was a professor in San Francisco. So she was really German American. Visiting fellowships, including Fulbright and DID professorships, took her to the CEU in Budapest, where she met Kim Scheppele, to Harvard Law School, the Free University of Berlin, and the University of Helsinki. Her main research interests lay in the areas of international business law, law of the European Union, and I would say first and foremost, socio-legal studies. That's when we met. Above all, Helen was a wonderful person, and she knew how to bring people together and how to inspire them with her humor and her interest in law and many other topics. We are delighted that Anne Griffith, Emerita Professor of Legal Anthropology at the University of Edinburgh, is with us today. She was a good colleague and a close friend of Helen's, and she'll be paying tribute to her and her academic life today. We're very pleased and grateful that you're here with us today. The new book collection on Socio-Legal Studies, which you're welcome to visit on the third floor of this library tower, is valuable not only to the work of our new research group at the VZW, but beyond. It is intended to become a place for scholars, especially early career researchers who wish to pursue a social legal project in Berlin. The VZW library provides guest access for this purpose, which Sylvia Höhne, I don't know where she is. Oh, yeah, she is. Sylvia will talk about in a minute. And if you'd like to use the library and these wonderful books, just get in touch with us, either with working group, with me, or with the VCP library. This leads me to thanking a few people. First of all, I'd like to thank my incredible team who did a great job to bring all the books here. And I see some smiles in the faces of this. We made the apartments where George was at that time with all the books, and I think we emailed in advance, and I said, well, we bring about like 20 cardboard boxes, and you were already a bit skeptical about whether that's enough. And when we got there, we had like 30, but that was not even I think half of what we would have needed. So we took the books down in these boxes and then piled them up in the van, which was something I'm very grateful for to Christian Boulanger. He's over there because he drove this big van, and I would never dare to drive it actually. And thank you very much. You were so important to bring all the books here. So the team and Christian did a great job, but above all, I want to thank Sylvia, who's here. She's hiding. I don't know for what reason. We can. I hand this over to you in a minute. Just as a librarian, Sylvia not just took care of reviewing, sorting, and cataloging all the books. It was about all your commitments that made this collection actually possible. I know it's not a given because you turned down offers for such big book donations from time to time, but in this case, you didn't, because I could convince you that these books are really valuable. And not only did you do this entire work with cataloging and sorting the books first and finding labels and things like that, it's much more work, as you can imagine. So something I really learned during this process. But you also provided for it to be on the internet, and you can find it there under the label of Professor Helen Hartnell. And you also chose this wonderful place for the book, as it's really great on the third floor. And you agree when we proposed to put up a portrait of Helen on these shelves. And so if you go there, you immediately know that this is the Lee collection from Helen, because you see her picture there. And thank you very much. It's been an incredible job. And now I hand the microphone over to you to expand a little more.
On behalf of my department, WIN, Wissenschaftliche Information Research, Wissenschaftliche Information, Research and Chemistry in English. Michael has invited me to say a few words about the creation of the new book collection, Socio-Legal Studies, which I'm very happy to do. First of all, what does WIN mean? Who are we? What do we do? We are a research support unit that assists VZW researchers through the entire research process with specialized and customized services. The library, which provides traditional information services, is one of 5 service areas. The others are the archive, research data, open access, and most recently, e-science. Incidentally, you can see an example of items from the archive here in this room. The showcase was films that use the VZB building as a filming location. What's particularly noteworthy is that the librarian is responsible for very specific research units and provides the researchers in these units with very personal and individual support in all library matters. Michael's department falls within my area of responsibility, which is why I am able to report on it here today. What we are talking about today in particular is located here in the library tower. It is said James Sterling, the architect of the building complex, was inspired by the library tower in Umberto Eco's novel The Name of the Rose when designing our tower. In the novel, knowledge is hidden and the search for truth is prevented as far as possible, and that is where the analogy ends. Because our library is open day and night to the researchers who work here. And even so, we are not really a public library. We warmly welcome guests who would like to work with our collections. And this naturally includes an invitation to all interested parties who would like to use the new collection. All that's needed is an informal notification to the library. The WZB library is a so-called special library. This means that we do not distinguish ourselves through a large book collection or specific collection areas, but above all through services such as subject-based literature research, for example. The tower contains the literature that we acquire at the request of researchers for their current WZB research. The topic and key areas change over the years. After more than 50 years of WZB research, we now have 150,000 books spread over 5 floors. We currently acquire around 500 volumes per year. In pre-digital times, this figure was around 3,000. The books are arranged according to 18 subject groups, some of which are disciplinary and some thematic, and are numbered consecutively. The Socio-Legal Studies collection, which we refer as the estate of Helen Hartnell, now occupies 6 shelves to the right and left of a reading place in the 3rd floor of the library tower within the subject group RERE, which means law in a broad sense. At this point, I would like to express my gratitude to the family and at the same time offer my sincerest condolence to them and also to the friends of Helen Hartnell. When Michael asked us to add the collection to our bookstock, we agreed, but these were our conditions. The collection is subject to the same conditions as the rest of the stock within a present subject group. The volumes are available to the entire WZB. They can be borrowed by all WZB employees, and they are integrated into the library catalog. We are often offered large, relatively unspecific book collection, as Michael said, which we usually decline because our space is limited and our task, as described, is to acquire books needed for current research. But this was the case here. Our collection in the subject area of law was rudimentary and outdated and offered no value to Michael's new research group with the new research topic at the WZB. So we seized the opportunity to provide the research group with a collection of relevant literature. At the same time, we took the opportunity to update our collection. Because if we wanted to add the new collection, we had to make room. And we also took the opportunity to bring in an external expert to evaluate the law collection. It was a bit of blackmail, I have to admit. Please, Michael, help us sort things out. We need space for your collection. And Michael helped, painstakingly working his way through 246 pages of old stock and marking what was outdated. By the way, my boss, Matis Reislov, was more or less happy to do the same with the MA, Mathematics, Statistics, Computer Science section of the stock on the same floor. Our hard-working student assistants, hi there, Alida, Ivo, Hannah, helped with the reorganization of the entire floor. Thousands of books from 3 subject groups were moved A lot had to be deleted from the catalog, and lists of space requirements for borrowed items had to be evaluated until there was finally enough space to set up the new collection. During the preparatory work, the volumes occupied all the shelves in the largest seminar room at the Scheppele. This was because Michael wanted them arranged according to very specific subcategories. The collection should be accessible to users via these subcategories of the law subject group. And so, where categories were being formed, books sorted, and the third floor rearranged, librarians pushed cart over cart loaded with volumes from the new collection back and forth across the hallways and catalogued them in our library system. And when the category were finished, the space cleared and the sorting completed, the specific terms were inventoried and the system with equal care. This meant that book cards once again rolled through the hallways, and each volume was given its self-number, its label, its special note on the specific subcategory, and its inventory tag, and a scan of its table of contents. A total of at least 15 people were involved in preparing the new collection. I counted 3 for your group, including the colleagues of the building services team who disposed of the discarded volumes. The scan, as the catalog enrichment, is not only created for the user's information, but normally also serves for the intellectual keyword indexing. This could be another added value for the library development if we want to introduce automated subject indexing, and sooner or later we will have to. We have a wonderfully defined training set for the artificial intelligence that will take on this job. Michael's subcategories are now important terms for catalog searches, but they will be also useful for whispers. And this is what the collection looks like in the catalog. A free text search for the name Hartnell yields 1,020 hits. You can see the subcategories in the notes and the link to the table of contents and the location, of course. With impressions of the catalog collection in the tower, I would like to thank you for your attention and for the opportunity to present our library. Thanks.
Severe for all this work. Sometimes we take things for granted, the library, for example, and there's so much work that needs to be done to present the books in a way we can present them to you now. And now I have the pleasure to ask Anne Griffith to give a tribute to Helen.
Thank you very much, Michael. Well, I indeed feel greatly honoured to be invited to say a few words about Helen Hartnell today among her colleagues, friends and family. And I would like to also add my voice to thanking everyone who has worked so hard to establish this day with the library in Helen's memory and who have made it possible for us all to come together to commemorate her legacy. Well, I feel a bit of a fraud because I think some of you have known her much longer than I did. I first met Helen in 2011 when I was a fellow at the International Research Centre on Work and the Human Life Cycle in Global History, a mouthful, that commonly known as RAY-work. We immediately hit it off. As lawyers, we acknowledged our mutual interest in addressing law from a socio-legal perspective, albeit from different standpoints. Helen came at the subject from an Anglo-American perspective with a focus on European law and later constitutional law, while I had a training in Scots law that led me to pursuing research and teaching in Southern Africa that brought me into dealing with African customary law. And this made me aware of the need to acquire an understanding of plural legal systems and legal pluralism that differed from traditional depictions of Western law. Well, Helen was deeply engaged in promoting socio-legal studies in Germany, and she was one of the founder members in this field here, organizing a network of scholars, organizing talks, and bringing people together to share their intellectual interests. She encouraged people to publish in this area and also contributed regularly to a vlog on the subject. And she remained enthusiastically committed to all these activities right up until her death. Well, despite our different entry points to socio-legal studies, what united us was a conviction that we needed to move beyond simply accounting for law in doctrinal terms, to account for it in more complex terms, situating it in relation to bodies and agencies that construct social relations, such as families, households, and economic and political institutions. The advantage of such an approach is that it opens up for discussion aspects that remain unaddressed by formal legal discourse. And these include the conditions that facilitate or impede access to legal forums, the factors that underpin the power and authority of narratives in social and legal settings, including the role of gender that lead to the empowerment of some individuals while silencing others, alternative strategies for those who are excluded or silenced by the formal legal system, the gap between law in theory and in practice, and the broader question of how law is configured and reconfigured through social processes that frame both its continuity and transformation over time. Such a discussion extends the remit of what constitutes a legitimate focus for legal inquiry by drawing together the threads of public and private dimensions of social life to reveal what underpins the relationship between power, law, and discourse that governs people's daily lives. In adopting this kind of approach, a more grounded view of law is required, one that uncovers the dimensions of power that are at work in all levels of society. And this kind of knowledge is especially pertinent today, given the conscious move towards authoritarian regimes in many parts of the world, a subject that Ken Scheppele will shortly address. It's especially important at a time when there is a global trend towards directing universities to concentrate on STEM subjects that encompass science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. Now, of course, these subjects are important, but this move in this direction has come together with a significant reduction in funding and resources for teaching and research in social sciences. I gather you're talking to Michael, you're not so badly off here in Germany, but I can assure you that in the United Kingdom, this is a real problem. And this marginalization of social science, especially in relation to law, marks a backward step, one that divorces law from its historical and temporal contexts. This allows for its redefinition of abstraction and distancing in law from society. This allows for a return to law as understood in its own terms, with all its rhetorical and ideological assertions that sweep aside contestation. Well, in teaching law, Helen always actively sought to make legal studies relevant to contemporary events, and she was a very popular teacher with students over generations. I remember when she had to teach online, she did not simply make do with the basics, but enrolled herself on several full-time courses that were extremely demanding in order to provide her students with a first-class experience of this type of teaching. I also remember how she pored over newspaper articles, contemporary popular texts, and cartoons to make law accessible to the students in the contemporary world. And alas, I remember how one year she was very upset when changes in copyright laws forced her to jettison these features and to return to more constrained formal legal texts. On a personal note, Helen's enthusiasm, as Michael has already mentioned, for life was one that was infectious, and it drew people to her from all walks of life into her orbit, in part because of her great sense of humour and sense of fun. An encounter with Helen was always a stimulating encounter and imbued with a sense of unfolding adventure. She loved to share jokes and to entertain her friends at home with excellent gourmet meals and copious helpings of wine. She loved to go out with friends to cocktail bars that sometimes left one feeling a little blurry the next morning. She enjoyed bringing her friends across continents into contact with one another, facilitating networks that extended beyond her. She was a very loyal person who stuck by her friends through thick and thin. She always tried to be supportive and caring, taking time to reach out to others, even in the last days of her life when she was so ill. I have personal experience of this when she tried to support me shortly after my husband died, which was very shortly before her own death. As a result, the world is a much duller place without her, for we all miss her scholarly, vibrant personality that encourages us to think and engage with individuals and worlds beyond ourselves. Thank you.
It's great. So, we are happy and pleased to have you here on screen, at least in Berlin, in the Library Tower. Just to give a little introduction for your talk, I want to talk again about Helen. When we met about 20 years ago, we had actually no doubts about the stability of Western democracies in Europe as well as in the United States. In Eastern Europe, we were already seeing a significant erosions, but we would never have thought it possible that in 2016, a president with an autocratic leadership style would be in charge on a Western state with deep democratic roots, such as the United States of America. Times have obviously changed. Not only Eastern Europe, but also in the United States and across the globe, we've been seeing authoritarian movements and leaders on the rise. It is clear there are no singular cases, accidents, and temporary backlashes to the unstoppable progress of liberal democracy. Today, it is clear that the specter of authoritarianism is here, it is strong, and it is here to stay. Like few others, Kim Lane Scheppele has examined the rise of authoritarianism and the role the law has played in this from a socio-legal perspective. Kim is Laurance as Rockefeller Professor of Sociology and International Affairs at the University of Princeton. We're delighted that you'll be giving a lecture on this topic for us today. I know you really wanted to be here today in person on Helen's birthday, and we put a lot of effort into coming here, but it wasn't possible under the circumstances, that's clear. All in all, we are so happy and honored to have you with us, at least virtually. And I should just say, the floor is yours, or better, the screen is yours.
Thank you so much. I wish I could be there in person, and as Michael said, I thought I could be, and unfortunately, I'm here teaching at Stanford for the quarter. I pinched a nerve in my back, so my background is blurry because there's actually a wheelchair there, and that's why I can't be with you in person. But I want to say, of course, start with some words about Helen, and I found this picture of Helen here in the Bay Area because she, in this picture, is more or less where I am now. Mostly I saw her in Berlin, but she spent a lot of her years here in the Bay Area as a more or less permanent graduate student at the program in jurisprudence and social policy at Berkeley. And the result of her scholarship here was to produce a really extraordinary dissertation on the development of European law. And I hope you see by the end of my lecture today that what I want to do is to pay tribute to Helen's knowledge of European law, because I used to think that was the most boring subject imaginable. And Helen was really the first person who taught me European law when we were both teaching on the faculty together at Central European University. Helen and I go back to the 1990s. We met at CEU in Budapest at a time of real democratic exuberance. And she persuaded me actually that EU law was interesting, and I couldn't possibly have done the work that I've done since in that area if she weren't my constant coach. And I miss her dearly, as I'm sure we all do in this room. And I'm just very glad that one of her legacies, which was her amazing ability to collect things, people, ideas, and also books, are also now honored in this collection. When I was in Berlin in the summer, I was really honored to have a chance to see the library before it was unveiled. And Michael gave me a tour of the library, and I urge you all to go see it. A mutual friend of Helen's and mine from Budapest, a woman named Anna Vesely, used to say that one of the things we all do is we travel around the world to go visit people who have the same books on their shelves that we do. And I was so struck in looking at Helen's library there at the WCW, just how much we overlapped in just every respect in our intellectual lives. And so I look forward to visiting this library as a kind of memory of Helen. And I wish I were there to see you all, because of course, Helen not only collected books, but she also collected people. You know, Helen was the sort of person who never lost a friend. And by that, I mean, not only did she just attract people and no one ever wanted to lose Helen as a friend, but she also was someone who stayed in touch with her friends. She reached out to friends. She had friends from childhood. She had friends from every single stage of her life. And she brought people together. And one of the reasons why I was so glad that Anne was willing to give that tribute to Helen was that Anne and I had met in the 1980s and lost track of each other. And when I was able to come visit Helen in Berlin, suddenly there was Anne. I got to meet Anne again, all through Helen. So I'm sure many people in the room have had that experience. But let me turn to my subject for today. And that is, every time I go to Europe now, everybody asks me, what is exactly going on in the United States? And as Michael said, I've been working on the rise and fall of democracy for a very long time, sharing with Helen, of course, the exuberance in the 1990s of the explosion of democracy in what we used to call Eastern Europe. And now, unfortunately, that area has really experienced a massive democratic decline, particularly Hungary, where both Helen and I lived and worked for such a long time. But of course, you know, Russia is more or less gone as a democracy. Poland's had real challenges. And so I started studying the fall of democracy and was very far advanced in that study when the US fell into the same category. So what I want to do today is, first of all, kind of assuage your concerns. Because if you knew Helen, you knew that all of her research was pretty apolitical. Her dissertation was on the rise of civil justice and civil justice cooperation in the European Union, which was one of those sleeper topics where the EU integrated across all of its member states in a really fundamental way, but a way that just attracted zero political attention. And so I want to say that when my talk today is political in one sense and not political in another. Oftentimes when people think about politics, what they think about is left-right politics, the things that people fight over, the things where many societies are really quite divided. Certainly the US is almost evenly divided now between people who hold views of the left and people who hold views of the right. But the kind of politics I'm going to talk about today is this kind of politics. Not so much left, right, and what kind of political ideologies people have, but politics in the sense of regime type. Is a country a democracy or is a country an autocracy? And in order to think about that question, there's a huge amount of ink that's been spilled on the question of what is a democracy. And I've learned to use a pretty rough and ready definition, which is that you have a democracy not if the person currently running the country was elected in a free and fair election, but whether this country has the possibility of getting to future free and fair elections where if the population decides it no longer wants that leader, it can get rid of them in a peaceful and orderly process. In order to get to a democracy here is a future-oriented idea. It requires that power has meaningful checks and balances so that it cannot be captured and held in just a few hands. By contrast, autocracy happens when power can no longer rotate, where the people have lost the ability to change their leaders through peaceful elections, where power is concentrated in a few hands, and the hallmark of autocracy is that power is then exercised arbitrarily at the autocrat's whim. So that's the kind of politics I want to be talking about today. Now, these days people say, well, when countries fall out of democracy into autocracy, it must be because the people wanted it. There's a huge literature on populism that sort of addresses this question. And I think this little chart tells you quite a lot, which is that populations may be evenly split left to right, but they tend not to be evenly split between whether their populations want a dictatorship or a democracy. This is the response of a survey from 2023, asking people, do you think a strong leader or the military would be a good way of governing this country? And what you see is actually the US has an alarmingly large percentage. Germany, fortunately, has about half the population wanting that. But basically what you don't find in any of these countries, including, look at Hungary, which is really, backslid quite a lot. You do not find workable electoral majorities in favor of moving toward autocracy. And so that's why I'm saying this is not what the people want. This is something that leaders bring. And the reason why leaders get away with it these days is that coups are not the way in which democracy dies anymore. Instead, democracy dies by law. And so democracy requires constraints on the executive, but obviously these can be changed. This is a map of the world that shows you, sort of the darker the blue, the more there are sort of meaningful checks on executive power. And one of the things you see is that the world varies quite a lot. And the US is, by the way, of course, not one of the countries that has the strongest checks. Now, I'm going to talk to you about the state of America. And Trump in his second term is very different from Trump in his first term. I call him the president again, Trump, came to power this time with a 900-page blueprint that outlined what he planned to do in the second Trump term. It was written by the Heritage Foundation, which is an American conservative foundation, with the support of many conservative groups. Interestingly enough, Viktor Orban's English language think tank, the Danube Institute, was one of the groups that contributed to this. And so when Trump came into office this time, unlike when he came to power the last time, he had this whole plan that really started day one with a huge blitz of activity. And so he hit the ground running. Probably many of you have forgotten some of these headlines because these are from the first couple of weeks. But it's really felt in the US like, agencies, American administrative agencies are being destroyed. People are being fired. There are now people pulled off the streets by masked agents whose provenance you don't know. Living in the US now, it feels like chaos. And the question I want to ask today is this autocracy? So the autocratic playbook can be derived from looking at how other autocrats have come to power. And this is just a bit of a rogues gallery of some of the autocrats I'd studied before Trump. Like I said, Helen and I lived and worked in Hungary for a long time, so that's been my primary focus. But when you look at how a lot of these leaders have tried to take over their governments and topple their democracies, what you find is that they tend to follow a common script. There's a set of activities that they engage in, and those activities are the things that tell you, whether you're on a kind of slide into autocracy. So what's the first step? Well, the first step is that the autocrats come to power by winning a free and fair election, okay? Which doesn't sound exactly like the worst possible step for creating a dictatorship, except that this is how all the autocrats come to power these days. Oftentimes you have some warning signals. So for example, Viktor Orban had denied the election results of the two elections before the one he won in 2010. He'd been prime minister before. He was deeply disappointed that he wasn't elected. And so he raised some questions about the fairness of Hungarian elections. We had Hugo Chavez in Venezuela, who had actually attempted a military coup before he came to power through elections. So dictators come to power through elections. And then they systematically dismantle checks on executive power. That's the thing you have to keep your eye on, is what's happening to executive power. And they do this either by sidelining in a lot of these other ways. So one thing is they capture the parliament or make it irrelevant. Sidelining legislation, governing by decree, for example. And parliaments often just acquiesce in this, which is really always the shocking part, although perhaps not so shocking for anyone who knows the 20th century history of Germany. These autocrats then try to capture the court, often through reforms, changing the way that judges are appointed, changing the disciplinary structure under which judges operate, attacking the independence of the judiciary by bringing them to heel under justice ministries or various forms of political tutelage. They upend the civil service to leave only loyalists in place. So very often, an aspirational autocrat, because they come to power and mass fire the civil service. These autocrats then ensure that loyalists are in the key, what I call muscle offices. So the ones that can bring the power of the state to bear against individuals in the most unpleasant way, if you're those individuals. So prosecutors who can bring criminal charges, tax enforcement officials, the police, the military, intelligence services, those are all targets for autocratic takeover so that they can be mobilized against populations that rise up. Harnessing the media as an echo chamber. So, making sure that the public doesn't get a lot of information except the information that the autocrat wants them to hear. Viktor Orban now controls upwards of 85% of the Hungarian media, for example. In Russia, it's extremely hard to find the media outlets that will tell you news that the current government does not want you to know about. Autocrats then harass opposition parties and the civil sector, often through defunding them. So one characteristic of some of these new autocrats is that they use the national budget to defund anyone who might oppose them. And then in the course of that defunding, they weaken them, hoping that they'll collapse. In the later stages of autocratic capture, you often get the encouragement of violence. This can happen both through the encouragement of private militias, gangs, and other non-official forms of violence to terrorize people who might stand up against the government, but it also might include encouraging violence on the part of state actors. And then finally, you're at an end when the autocrat rewrites the election laws so that they'll never lose again. Now, there's a much longer version of the script. That's the short version. But if those are the steps you have to look for to tell whether a government is sliding toward autocracy, let's look at the US. So winning free and fair election, this is Trump won in 2016. As you all know, he refused to leave office or tried to undermine the orderly transfer of power in 2020. And so that everybody was on notice. But even before election 2024, Trump was joking about how he would only be a dictator on day one. Of course, he had also run into trouble with the law. He had been convicted of more than 30 felonies, and there were several trials pending at the time that he was elected again. And if those charges had been proven, it would have demonstrated that he had tried to overthrow the last elected government. So that was step one, sidelining the parliament. Okay, so here, the American Congress has been notably silent. They stood up to Trump at first because Trump had asserted that we have a system in which all major officials of the US government get nominated by the president, but then they have to be confirmed by the Senate. Trump had suggested, well, maybe the Senate should go into recess so they don't have to bother confirming my high officials. And the Senate decided to actually go through the confirmation process. But after that, the Congress has basically been inert. And as we are speaking here, Congress is out of the House of Representatives, hasn't met in a month. The Senate can't do much without the House, and the whole government actually has gone into closure, basically. Capturing the judiciary. Well, in Trump's first term, the one thing that he accomplished was a very organized plan to pack the judiciary with loyalists, particularly at the Supreme Court. Not surprisingly, that court, which had on it many of the loyalists that Trump had appointed, then ruled last summer, or the summer before last, summer of 2024, that presidents were immune from criminal prosecution for anything they did, broadly speaking, that was part of their official duties while they were in office. Now, since Trump has come to power, he's issued a huge number of executive orders, and there are nearly 500 cases now pending in the courts trying to challenge a lot of those executive orders and a lot of these changes of our legal system. And the lower courts have really tried to stop them. But every single case that has gone to the Supreme Court so far, the Supreme Court has backed Trump, even though the executive orders and the actions that Trump is taking violate what we all would have thought was the law as of the time Trump was inaugurated. So the judiciary is standing up against, executive expansion of powers at the lower level, but the Supreme Court is letting him do it. Politicizing the civil service. Well, this was where Trump came in and had his Office of Management and Budget, but also this new agency called DOGE, the Department of Governmental Efficiency, mass fire federal workers. It's a little hard to tell exactly how many were fired because huge numbers were fired, then the courts ordered them reinstated, then the government put them on leave. But there have been, we knew as of early April, and it's been hard to get counts since then, that about 125,000 federal workers were just fired without cause right at the start. Dismantling other checks on executive power. Well, Trump is, as this headline says, and by the way, what I'm giving you are sort of headlines from a whole variety of different media outlets in the United States. Trump is barreling through the guardrails. There's just a whole series of things that we would not have thought possible, that we would have thought would have been illegal if a president tried them. And Trump is just trying them, and nobody's standing in his way. When he brought Elon Musk into the government early on, Elon Musk, who had an uncertain job, nobody knew exactly what his governmental contract was. Was he an employee? Was he not? His people would go into all these different agencies and just take their data and also affect, and modify their computer programs. And to this day, nobody quite knows what that agency has done. So what you see is that Trump can just order people to do stuff. And so far, he's gotten away with it, really knocking down all the guardrails that might have kept him in check. And of course, his family has gotten immensely wealthy just in the last 9 months, weaponizing the power of the presidency into massive conflict of interest that have benefited financially his own family. On the muscle institutions, I'm walking you through that checklist, just looking at the American evidence. Trump did not hesitate to put into key offices right away loyalists, and the most consequential have been this woman in white, Pam Bondi, who is now our Attorney General, which is the equivalent of a justice minister. She has been mass firing career prosecutors in the Justice Department, and instead installing a lot of loyalists who, as you've probably seen, started to come out with indictments against Trump's, hit list of enemies, even though these indictments seem incredibly weak, and we'll see whether the criminal charges will go through. But still, there's been this weaponization of the prosecution service against Trump's enemies. The guy in the upper right is the US's new defense secretary, zero experience for the job. And he has been obediently carrying out Trump's whims, most recently blowing up boats in international waters, both in the Caribbean and now in the Pacific, killing people on the spot by claiming that they are drug dealers with absolutely no evidence presented that makes those claims credible. So we now have this weaponization of our Defense Department, of our Justice Department, and also of the FBI, the Federal Investigative Police. Turning the media into an echo chamber, well, this is just every day. There's more signs that the media, because their financial interests are being pressured, are turning around and then starting to fall in line with Trump. The Washington Post, owned by Jeff Bezos, was pressured into giving up on all of its editorial page coverage by the fact that Jeff Bezos needs the U.S. Post Office to allow him to gain money through his Amazon, astonishing logistics activity. CBS, which is one of our big networks, was just bought by an ally of Trump, and they've now put someone with zero news experience in charge of the news department, and they've basically gotten rid of all their mainline correspondents. And you can sort of go through a whole series of the media who were paying Trump off for fake libel actions and so on. The media have really been treating Trump very gingerly because they know he can come after them. Attacking civil society. Well, here's where Trump has gone after NGOs, after universities, after law firms, and also after political rivals. And now Trump is purporting to investigate all the sources of fundraising that the opposition party, that the Democratic Party, is using in elections. So again, it's a kind of cross-the-board blitz against all of these institutions. Culture of violence, again, walking through the steps. This is step 9 out of 10. The culture of violence has just immensely increased in 2 ways. One is that many people who are, judges, members of Congress, people who are election officials, are discovering that they're just getting anonymous threats. And so a lot of these people are quitting their jobs. We have judges who are, there's a whole scandal now around around pizza deliveries. Many judges and also members of Congress and other public officials are home in the evening, their doorbell rings, pizza delivery, pizza for you. And then what that tells you is that we know where you live. And in the case of judges, these pizza deliveries have come in the name of a son of a federal judge who was murdered on the judge's doorstep when somebody came to kill the judge. And now these pizza deliveries are coming in the name of the murdered son of the federal judge to judges' homes all over the country. We've had at least 70 instances of that happening just in the last few months. So the culture of violence is really spreading. And of course, this is also violence being carried out at the hands of the state itself. There's now a massive effort to deport people who are not lawfully in the country. And ICE, which is the Immigration and Customs Enforcement Police, have been traveling with masks, often without any insignia explaining who it is that they are. And they simply grab people off the streets. So not surprisingly, they're now ICE imitators, kidnapping people off the streets and holding them for ransom because you can't tell who's an official and who's not. So the level of violence is really ramped up. And finally, last step in autocratic capture is rewriting the election law. And this is something that's already been happening. So Trump issued an executive order back in March that changes the criteria for voting in American elections. His minions are already trying to carry this out, even though a federal court has tried to stop them. And already Trump and his allies are saying Trump should be able to run again for president in 2028, even though the Constitution pretty clearly bars someone from being elected president more than 2 times. They're just saying, well, who's going to stop them? And given what's happening, then you wonder. All right, so where does all this go? The US is already very far along toward a system of autocratic capture. And this is where I'm going to invoke Helen. Because what I learned from Helen is that when you look at the European Union, you've got multiple layers of law. And not just multiple layers of, sort of technical law, but multiple layers of value-laden law. So what happens in these systems of autocratic capture is that the autocrats attack their national constitutional orders. And where you can get help, where you can restore democracy by law and not just lose it by law, is by invoking these other areas of law, these other levels of law, to try to bring that back into the national constitutional space to push back the efforts of the autocrats. So help can come from these other layers of law. Now, when Hungary was failing, and then when Poland followed suit, This was when suddenly everything Helen taught me came back. The question was, how do we save Hungary? How do we save Poland? And the answer was, if you read the Treaty on European Union, Article 2, it contains values that the Hungarian government and then the Polish government were violating, particularly democracy and the rule of law. And so many of my colleagues and I tried to start this process of pressuring the EU to use its power to crack down on these rogue governments. It required actually establishing some new law, required persuading all the institutions of the EU. And I knew nothing about EU law except I knew who to ask. So Helen was my tutor through the last 15 years as I've tried to learn EU law, to be able to use that and to be able to convince the EU that they should use this law against Hungary and against Poland. And finally, in December of 2022, all the institutions of the EU, particularly the Commission and the Council, voted to cut the funds to Hungary and Poland that were sustaining those governments. And what we saw was that in the next Polish election, a pro-democratic force won. And now for the first time in Hungary, we see Orban losing in the polls because ultimately it was the EU money that kept those things alive. So you weaponize the EU values, you bring them to bear on member states, and maybe you can make a difference. So then how can we use that insight in the US? And this is where I think what we're seeing is that we don't have, the US never signs on to anything international that could come back to bite it. But what we do have in the US is a pretty robust system of federalism. And so what we've seen since January 20th is that what's the so-called blue states, okay, remember in the US, red and blue, red is the right, whereas, in the US, whereas it's the left in Europe, and blue is the left in the US. This is a map that shows you the states. The blue states are the ones that reliably vote Democratic. The red states are the ones that reliably vote Republican, and the ones in gray are sort of divided in swing states. And what we saw was that the blue states attorneys general, those are like the justice ministers of the blue states, started meeting actually a year ahead of Trump's second election here. And they started saying, how can we weaponize federalism as a defense against autocratic takeover at national level? They meet daily. If you want to know, they use Microsoft Teams. They meet every day at 4 o'clock Eastern time for a video conference, and they have brought some of the most consequential lawsuits pushing back Trump's autocratic takeover. This is just a partial list of these cases, but these are the ones that have been already pretty influential, and they've won preliminary injunctions or restraining orders barring Trump from carrying out a lot of these policies, at least until it gets to the Supreme Court. So what we're seeing is that, is American democracy in danger? Well, I've tried to show you that if you learn that autocratic script from watching how other countries fall into dictatorship, the US is already quite far along. But what we're seeing is that, what I learned from Helen, you go outside the national level to another level of law, and you look at what that other level of law can do to enable you to push back. And for Hungary and Poland, it was the EU. And for the US, I'm hoping it's federalism. And so is American democracy in danger? Absolutely. But it's not yet the end. So thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Kim, for these insights and the ending on a high note, I would say, at least some hope for how we can bring the law back in to fight authoritarianism, maybe by looking on other levels. And here in the EU, it's the EU level, and in the United States, maybe the federal states. So now the floor is open to questions or comments, maybe. So we have a little time, and I think there were many things in your talk that may prompt some questions or comments.
Hello, yeah. Bernard Casey from Berlin originally. I met Helen Hartnell in 1980. Ich war der Herr aus England und sie war die Dame aus Amerika und wir waren zusammen am Goethe-Institut. So that's how we got to know one another. I am an economist, not a lawyer, but one of the things I have been struck by in Europe is the craven nature, actually, of the European Union. And I point to the example of the EU tariff treaty, which was, in fact, nothing other than, it seems to me, a submission to Trump. There was not. I don't think we're going to see European opposition, but I also don't see that we're going to find European opposition to a lot of what is going on in Europe either, because again, at the European level, there have been concessions made to the named countries of the East in order to buy their support for this, that, or the other, including attitudes to providing towards the war in the Ukraine. So I'm rather less optimistic maybe than you are about these countervailing powers, and I hope you could reassure me a bit. Thank you.
Yeah, so this is maintaining democracy requires constant vigilance. And after that victory that, those of us fighting for democracy in Europe had in December 2022, when something like 36 billion euros to Hungary were frozen and something like 120 billion euros to Poland were frozen, that resolve has not been uniform. So, for example, after the Polish election, as soon as Donald Tusk, became prime minister again, Ursula von der Leyen said, great, problem solved, and we're going to give you all the money. Okay, now the problem is, of course, that Poland still had a captured judiciary. And once they got all the money back, the ability, the leverage that the EU could have used to force the changes, the actual changes in Poland disappeared. It was a really, I think, dumb thing to do. And as you mentioned, what happened, Orban is very clever. He's very transactional. He and Trump get along very well. In fact, today, on Helen's birthday, I'm afraid, Trump is actually Orban's visiting Trump in the White House today, seeking favors from Trump. Okay, so what Orban has done is every time there's a question where the EU needs his vote, and this is the EU needs his vote for any foreign policy or budgetary matter, Orban's like, okay, so how much are you going to give me for my vote? I'm not going to vote for free. And unfortunately, von der Leyen's been willing to bargain with him. So of that initial 36 billion euro, she gave him 10 billion for him to conveniently leave the room when the vote on Ukrainian accession came up in the council. So yes, I think the EU has trouble maintaining a spine on this stuff. And what it means is that we have to just keep pressuring them. And the forces that want compromise and want von der Leyen to not say anything about the state of democracy inside member states have to just keep putting as much pressure on her as possible to get us back to the place that we were in December 2022. So it's not a once and done thing. It requires people to stand up for democracy and to think that the EU can be an agent of democratic change. So yeah, everybody has to work on it.
So we have another. Okay.
Hello, my name is Adit, and I'm also I'm linked to Bernard, and so Helen was our first friend in Berlin when we moved here at the beginning of 1980. And she met Bernard in the Goethe Institute, and she was the first friend we met in Berlin. I wanted to ask a question about the Supreme Court in America. Of course, if you have a president like today who has autocratic tendencies, the president has the power to appoint the Supreme Court judges. And so, of course, Trump has had a lot of luck. In his first term, he had to replace various judges. Now, I was reading now about what's going on with the Supreme Court judges trying to get an assessment of the legality of the tariffs, which Trump has been imposing on any country, on any commodity, for any time. It's completely random, really. And I was reading a report from the BBC correspondent in Washington, and he said that some of the right-wing judges, they are worried that Trump has indeed been encroaching on the powers of Congress, because it's Congress who is allowed to set tariffs, and they're debating the definition between taxes. Is the tariff a tax or is it not? But so this is a good thing. At least they have had a long session, and this right-wing leaning Supreme Court is actually discussing this to some length. But what worried me about the report of the BBC correspondent is that he said, although some of the very right-wing judges are worried that Trump is not behaving in line with the Constitution, if you were to rule against him, it would be such a mess trying to repay all these billions to countries who have been paying import tariffs, and that's all the commercial and practical aspect of reversing this so-called illegal activity of Trump would be too costly, too impractical. So you have yet another dimension, never mind the legality, but is it affordable to declare it illegal? And so, this sort of, it makes me despair, because where then is the solution? Eh?
Yeah,
I don't
well,
really
you're
know
not the
what
only
my
one.
question is, but thank you very much. Thank
Yes,
you very much
thank
for
you.
listening.
Do you want to
And it's very nice to
briefly
meet
answer?
you.
Nice
It's
to
very
meet you.
nice
And
to meet you, yeah.
and like I said, Helen has so many friends from so many phases of her life. And, even in the last 2 years since she's been gone, we still meet each other, right? So I'm delighted to meet you all. So first of all, you're incredibly well informed about this tariff issue. And what's been controversial, of course, is that Trump just makes stuff up, right? So what he did in the case of these, the tariffs that are being challenged, is that he used this law called IEPA, the International Economic Emergency Powers Act, to declare a state of emergency between the US and the entire world. And on this so-called Liberation Day, I guess he called it, when he just announced these global tariffs on everybody, he used those emergency powers. And he's been issuing other tariffs under other powers. So the only ones that are being challenged now at the Supreme Court, and the oral argument was just a couple days ago, those are the ones under this emergency power. Okay, now, nobody, how to put it, there are many things, including this, that no one would have thought were legal before Trump did it. And now all of a sudden what you're finding is that a lot of people and a lot of the Trump judges were worried are going to fall in line behind saying that he can use these powers. Now, what's been happening, so first of all, if the court finds that the tariffs under the Emergencies Act were unlawfully issued, probably they're not going to require payment back of all of the money that has since been charged with the tariffs. They'll probably issue a forward-looking remedy. So I think we're not going to get into the who paid what and how do you restore it, which is, a form of theft probably, but hard to remedy. What we're worried about here is that if the Supreme Court finds, and it was very hard to tell from the oral argument which way the court was going to go, if they find that the president has the power to issue global tariffs under this emergencies law, when the Constitution, as you rightly said, explicitly says, it says tariffs are what Congress does, it will be yet another abolition of an important power of Congress and another grant of more or less unlimited executive power to the president. This is what we're worried about. So far, the Supreme Court has heard 24 challenges to Trump's actions since January. And in every single case, they've expanded executive power. So that's what we're worried about with tariffs. There may be, because this has created such a stir in the business community, which is a traditional conservative pillar, there may be a possibility that the court will rule that this particular use of emergency powers is unconstitutional. But since Trump issued those tariffs, he's been issuing new tariffs under different legal authorities. And so even if the Supreme Court finds against him, many of the tariffs may remain because Trump will just declare them under some other legal authority, right? So it's a big, complicated technical area, but this may be an area where the Supreme Court stands up to him, but it won't matter. That's the other problem. So yeah, we're all nervous about this case.
Okay, I look around. So otherwise, I would have another question referring to what you said about the Supreme Court, because I'm not an expert in that, but I'm really surprised how little resistance Trump meets at the Supreme Court. Now, I mean, he appointed 2 justices in his first term, but the other 3 conservative judges were not appointed by him, and I wonder why they seemingly are so willing to actually give him the executive powers he wants, and he's pushing the boundaries, and seemingly the Supreme Court does actually nothing to push back, and I'm just very astonished and would like to hear a bit from someone like you why that is.
Yeah, so the important thing to say is that there are two strands along which the American conservative movement has moved, right? So one is the issues that people fight over, abortion, gun regulation, affirmative action, all these kind of policy and rights questions where conservatives and liberals have really different positions. But I think what's gone relatively unnoticed, and part of the reason why I talk about autocracy the way that I do, is that autocracy is really a matter of executive power and its constraints. It doesn't have all that much to do, at least directly, with these other areas that people fight about in constitutional law that distinguish left and right. And there's a strand of the conservative movement in the United States going back to, well, probably Richard Nixon, but really under Ronald Reagan, that has argued that the American Constitution grants all executive power to the person of the president. And so all this effort by Congress to create administrative agencies with constraints posed by Congress are unconstitutional. This is a debate that goes back to the 80s. And it was heightened. In fact, the US just recently, a few days ago, lost Dick Cheney, who was the vice president under Bush II. He was one of the biggest advocates of concentrating all executive power in the hands of the president. And some of these judges that we see now were appointed by Reagan, some appointed by Bush. And what they've all been screened for is exactly this thing. It's called the unitary executive theory, which is all about the expansion of executive power. So this has been a long-term project. Now, of course, the conservatives who started this, how to put it, Trump is not a conservative. Trump is a revolutionary. As they built this unitary executive theory in order to accomplish more traditional conservative purposes, it got hijacked, and their party got hijacked out from under them by this revolutionary force that now wants to use this immense amount of executive power for revolutionary ends, not conservative ends. So in many ways, the movement got kidnapped, but you've got all these judges who were put there to expand executive power, and that's what we're seeing. So it's, Trump is just the beneficiary of a long-term movement that didn't expect he'd be the one that would benefit. Some of my, I keep saying some of my best friends now are the people I call homeless Republicans. I miss arguing with smart conservatives who were actually genuinely conservative, but they have no political party in the United States. And so I keep saying, one of the most crucial things we need to do in the United States in order to recover democracy is to have a conservative party that believes in the Constitution. In many ways, this is the same dilemma Germany faces, right? That there's a difference between system parties and anti-system parties. The problem in the United States, given our electoral system, is that with a first past the post constituency-based electoral system, you basically are forced into a two-party system. And when one party becomes an anti-system party, you're really in danger. But the Supreme Court story is that it started as a system movement and then went off the rails. But you've got 6 votes for a lot of this stuff, and that's where we are.
Thank you. Thank you very much. We have one more question, so maybe brief.
I wanted to ask a slightly more provocative question. That is that there might be things which dislodge Trump that are not the obvious things. And I think of what happened to the mafia leaders in the 1930s. In the end, they weren't felled for the mafia-like practices. They got felled for tax evasion. Do you think there's any chance that Trump will get felled because of his relationships with people like Epstein and the scandal that might come out of that? Because that's where he might be, within his own movement, vulnerable. That's the thing which people possibly don't approve of.
Yeah. No, I think you're absolutely right to say that. And I think this presidency has an unpredictable ending. I think Trump is not planning on ending this presidency ever. But there may be things like scandal that bring him down. And what you're seeing actually now in the Republican Party are some people that were Trump's strongest supporters peeling away from him, either over the Jeffrey Epstein thing or over the shutdown of the American government. We have a federal government that's mostly not functioning, you know. And so there's starting to be cracks in his movement, and it could be that will bring him down. I think it's really quite unpredictable. And there are a couple of other things that I think we should, also keep in mind. One is that these state attorneys general that I was mentioning are now starting to look at the powers they have under their state law to bring at least some members of the Trump entourage to heel. So, for example, their state governors now threatening to arrest these federal police that are doing these, violent immigration arrests for using excessive force. And it could be that chipping away at this thing from a lot of different angles will bring it down. But yeah, I mean, certainly the Epstein files are one of those things that, everybody who's nervous about democracy in America is hoping something, comes out of those files. And certainly Trump is acting like a guilty person in the extent to which he's gone to keep those files from becoming public. But, Trump has a kind of charisma and an appeal and a big media operation now that can actually withstand a lot of scandal. He's lived through so many scandals already that would have brought down any ordinary politician, and he's survived them all. So, yes, as you can tell from this presentation, I hope something brings him down. I hope it's not political violence. But, at this stage, the US is in really quite a degree of chaos, and it's quite unpredictable what happens next.
Okay, thanks a lot. We have one last question, I would say.
Good evening. My name is Sandra Lust. Is the mic on? It is. Okay.
Yes. Huh?
Okay. My name is Sandra Lustig, and I had the privilege of being a friend of Helen's for only 17 years, which I think is fairly short, looking around the room here. I'm not a lawyer, and I don't play one on TV. Ketanji Brown Jackson, Supreme Court Justice, in a dissenting opinion, recently referred in a footnote to Frankel's theory of the dual state. The dual state, which he developed during the Nazi period, the dual state basically being a state that operates at 2 levels at the same time, or 2 systems at the same time. One system where the rule of law does apply, at least kind of, say for the business community, for business transactions, and another area where the rule of law does not apply when it comes to minority groups or groups the government doesn't like, to put it loosely. Would you see that being the state or the U.S. moving in that direction, or being there already? Would you like to speak on that? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. So, once again, a German contribution to understanding where we are. Absolutely. And but what's so interesting is that so yes, for many people in America, life has not changed at all. If it had changed for more people, we would have a bigger reaction. So this is also the logic of the dual state, not just that you have these 2 tracks, but that leaders can get away with this absolute arbitrariness on some matters, as long as for most people, life seems normal. Okay. What's been happening though, I mean, that was, I think, that made sense. And I actually wrote about dual state back in, I think, early February, because I think that's where we were in early February. By now, even that's broken down. And part of it is just the immense amount of public violence that's coming about through these immigration raids, through the militarization, like calling out what we call the National Guards, which are kind of state armies, in order to showing up with this kind of military gear in American cities, policing them on a regular basis. I mean, it's very hard to say when you get to that stage that life is normal for a lot of people. So even the dual state was a stage we passed through from about February through maybe July, right? And now it's that, even that's breaking down. But you're absolutely right to say that the way that these kinds of autocrats stay in power is to try to make life normal for their supporters, even as life becomes absolutely chaotic and unpredictable for their enemies. And so, yeah, I mean, for anyone who's been to the US recently, I mean, I think you'll be shocked at how much it's changed, just on a daily basis in American cities. And so how long this can go on for is the question that we're all asking, and what's going to stop it has become the most urgent inquiry. So this is where, I'm hoping as the federal government collapses all around us, that the state governments will rise up and at least push back. So yeah, I mean, am I optimistic? It's hard to be as pessimistic as the situation seems to require and still sleep at night. But yeah, I think a lot of us are now working toward restoring some sense of normality, which is going to mean curbing the powers of this president somehow. But dual state, absolutely. Lots of people in the US are now talking about the dual state.
Yeah, thank you very much. And not so optimistic ending. And I think we could go on to ask what damage has already been done to the democratic discourse, and how you could reestablish some kind of liberal democratic thinking in the whole system. So stopping what's going on is the first step, but then thinking about how we can recreate this kind of liberal democracy in the US and elsewhere is the much more difficult task. I mean, it has to come first to do something against what's going on at the moment, but in the long run, I think it's a really daring task. But it's so good to have people like you doing this work. And I think it's been really a wonderful, not so wonderful with regard to content, but wonderful with regard to what we wanted to show, that Helen Hartnell really loved the US and Europe, and she tried to borrow things from both cultures and bring them together. And she was also a wonderful ambassador for the United States culturally, and as well with her political views and her views as an academic. And I want to hand the microphone over for a last word to George.
Thank you. At about 10 o'clock this morning, over my second cup of coffee, Peter Schuster said, "Well, what are you going to say tonight?" And my response to that was, I didn't realize that, oh, can you not hear? I'm sorry. I didn't realize that my comments would be of value to this. But I just wanted to thank everyone on behalf of the Hartnell family. And when I say that, I include the Berlin family and of all of her family of friends that she learned to appreciate. And as Anne said, Helen made friends and brought people together, and those were all part of her collective family. Michael, we can't thank you enough for what you've done with all of her books. I don't have control of the screen or the images that you had up here, but one of them showed these nice books, as you see here, up on shelves. And I shared that room with all of Helen's books for 2 months, and I could only walk through a space about like that, And when Michael, yeah, that's AI. It can't really look like that. But Michael showed up with his students, and the story he tells about the 20 boxes and 30 boxes, it goes back to the movie Jaws when the sheriff says, "We got to get a bigger boat." But all those books were gone, and I had a whole room to sleep in. The bookcases came down. And then when I got rid of her fun books, her novels and such, which she never had time to read, then I had more room. But Michael, I thank you, your staff, and everything that the WZB has done. And thank you so much for your comments. Kim, I can't thank you enough for all of your comments. I do have to say, though, that for the last week I've been in Europe and haven't heard anything about what's going on in the States, and I was so glad that I didn't have to listen to, for lack of a better word, the shit show that's going on over there, that my stomach was finally coming unknotted. And you just tightened it back up again, just hearing about all these things that are going on. And I know Helen would have loved your talk, and I know she is loving your talk. Many of you may remember 2 years ago today we had the celebration of Helen's life, and one of the things I said there, or one of the stories I told there, I'll retell here. But Helen, when Helen was in Hungary, of course Helen loved to cook and she loved to eat and she loved Thanksgiving. So while she was there, she was going to have everybody over for a Thanksgiving meal. So she went out into the Hungarian countryside and found sort of the biggest turkey she could. Unfortunately, in Hungary, her oven was probably the smallest thing you've ever seen. So she cut it into 4 pieces and cooked each of the 4 pieces separately. And then, well, she can't serve a turkey like that. So she got, I want to say it was probably dental floss. and sewed all 4 pieces together. So she had this whole turkey. And I think all of her friends, this is sort of how she's treated her friends, not as pieces of meat. But she's found some way to bring everybody together and keep them together. On behalf of my family, I can't wait to get downstairs to see it, because again, it was just a mess. And I'm the cataloging, that's incredible. And I thank you and for making good use of this. Helen, I keep going on, but Helen, I kept saying, why don't you retire? She always had friends coming through and never had time enough to spend with her friends because she was teaching this and getting ready for that. I said, Helen, you take a step back. And I realized that that's what she enjoyed doing. She enjoyed teaching. She enjoyed inspiring young women, young students, and she loved the law and the changes in the law. I think she hated practicing law, but she loved the law itself. And I know, Helen, thank you all for coming. I know some of you have come from great distances, and it speaks well for Helen that you thought enough of her to come to this wonderful celebration. But Michael, thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Roy. So,